The sun was setting over the quiet neighborhood of Maple Street, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Children played in their front yards while parents watered gardens and chatted over white picket fences. It was the kind of peaceful evening that made people grateful for simple pleasures. Tommy Morrison had just finished his shift at the auto repair shop downtown. His hands were still stained with motor oil, and his back ached from bending over car engines all day. At 28, Tommy wasn't the young troublemaker he once was, but some habits died hard. His black leather jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and his motorcycle boots clicked against the pavement as he walked toward his Harley-Davidson parked outside Murphy's corner store. The bike was his pride and joy, a 1998 Sportster that he'd bought second-hand and spent 2 years restoring. Every chrome detail gleamed under the streetlights, and the engine purr was music to his ears. Tommy had plans to ride out to the lake, maybe grab a beer and watch the stars come out. It had been a long week, and he needed to clear his head, so. He approached his motorcycle. Tommy noticed a small golden retriever tied to a lamppost nearby. The dog was panting heavily, its tongue hanging out as it looked around desperately for its owner. A bowl of water sat empty beside it, and the poor animal was clearly distressed from the heat and waiting. Most people would have felt sympathy for the helpless creature, but Tommy was in a foul mood. His boss had yelled at him earlier for a mistake. That wasn't even his fault. His girlfriend Sarah had been giving him the cold shoulder for 3 days, and his rent was due tomorrow with barely enough money in his account. The sight of the anxious dog somehow annoyed him further. "Stupid mutt," Tommy muttered under his breath as he fumbled for his keys. The dog looked up at him with hopeful brown eyes, its tail wagging slightly as if asking for help. This only irritated Tommy more. Without thinking clearly, he lifted his boot and gave the dog a swift kick to its side. The golden retriever yelped in pain and surprise, stumbling backward as far as the leash would allow. Its trusting eyes now showed fear and confusion. Tommy felt a momentary surge of satisfaction, as if he'd finally taken control of something in his frustrating day. He actually chuckled to himself, shaking his head as he straddled his motorcycle. "That's what you get for being in my way," he said with a smirk, starting up the engine. The Harley roared to life, its powerful sound echoing through the quiet street. Tommy revved it a few times, enjoying the attention it drew from nearby residents who looked out their windows. But his moment of twisted satisfaction was short-lived. As he prepared to pull away from the curb, Tommy noticed a figure emerging from Murphy's corner store. The man was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene before him. He wore simple jeans and a black t-shirt, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. The stranger's eyes moved from Tommy to the injured dog, which was now whimpering and trying to lick its sore ribs. The man's jaw tightened and his hands slowly clenched into fists at his sides. He set down his bag of groceries carefully on the sidewalk and walked toward Tommy with deliberate, measured steps. Tommy had seen enough movies to recognize danger when it walked toward him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He kept the engine running and tried to look tough, though something about this stranger made his heart race with nervousness. "You got a problem with how I handle animals?" Tommy called out over the noise of his motorcycle, trying to sound braver than he felt. The stranger didn't respond immediately, instead kneeling down beside the golden retriever. The dog initially cowered away from the man's outstretched hand, but something gentle in his approach seemed to calm the frightened animal. He spoke in soft, soothing tones that Tommy couldn't hear over his engine, checking the dog's ribs with careful hands. The retriever began to trust him, even managing a weak tail wag. When the stranger finally stood up and turned his full attention to Tommy, there was something in his expression that made the younger man's bravado crumble. It wasn't anger exactly, but rather disappointment mixed with determination. He looked like someone who had seen too much cruelty in the world and had decided to do something about it. "Turn off the engine," the man said quietly, but his voice carried clearly despite the motorcycle's rumble. There was an accent there, British maybe, and an authority that made Tommy's hand automatically reach for the ignition. "Why should I?" Tommy shot back, though his voice cracked slightly. He was beginning to realize he might have picked the wrong person to mess with today. The stranger looked like he could bench press a small car, and those weren't the soft hands of someone who spent his days behind a desk. "Because we need to have a conversation about what just happened," the man replied, taking another step closer, "and I don't like repeating myself." Tommy's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He could gun the engine and speed away, but something told him this stranger wouldn't let the matter drop. There was something familiar about the man's face, though Tommy couldn't quite place where he might have seen him before. The golden retriever whimpered again, and the sound seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet street. Neighbors had begun to gather on their porches and peer out their windows, sensing that something significant was about to unfold on their peaceful block. Tommy's hand hovered over the throttle, his decision hanging in the balance. The setting. Sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 7 o'clock. Time seemed suspended as two very different men faced each other over the fate of one small injured dog. Everything that would happen next would change Tommy Morrison's life forever, though he didn't know it yet. All he knew was that his simple plan for an evening ride had just become much more complicated. Tommy reluctantly turned off his motorcycle engine, the sudden silence making every sound seem amplified. The gentle whimpering of the dog, the distant murmur of concerned neighbors, and the soft scrape of the stranger's boots on concrete all felt unnaturally loud. Tommy's heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Good choice," the stranger said, his British accent more noticeable now in the quiet evening air. He kept his eyes locked on Tommy while gently stroking the golden retriever's head. "Now, I'd like you to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to hurt this animal." Tommy tried to summon his earlier bravado, but it felt hollow now. "Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but that dog was in my way. I've had a rough day, and I don't need some stranger lecturing me about your rough day," the man interrupted, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that made Tommy's stomach clench. "Tell me, does having a bad day usually involve taking out your frustrations on defenseless creatures?" The question hit Tommy harder than he expected. When put that way, his actions sounded even worse than they had felt in the moment. He noticed more neighbors gathering, some holding their own dogs protectively, others with their arms crossed and disapproving expressions on their faces. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down was shaking her head sadly, and Tommy realized he recognized most of these people. This was his neighborhood too. "It's not like I seriously hurt it," Tommy mumbled, but even as he said the words, they sounded weak and pathetic. The golden retriever was still favoring its right side, and its earlier enthusiastic tail wagging had stopped completely. The stranger stood up slowly, and Tommy was struck again by how imposing the man was. He wasn't just tall. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced real danger and come out on top. There was something almost familiar about his face, like Tommy had seen him somewhere before, but he couldn't place where. "Not seriously hurt?" the man repeated, kneeling back down beside the dog. "Let me show you something." He gently lifted the retriever's fur along its ribs, revealing a red mark where Tommy's boot had connected. The dog whimpered softly at the touch, and several of the watching neighbors gasped. Tommy felt his face flush with shame. Seeing the actual injury made his actions real in a way that hadn't hit him before. This wasn't just some moment of frustration. He had genuinely hurt a living creature that had done nothing wrong. I didn't mean to," Tommy started, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he didn't mean to kick the dog as hard as he did? That he was just having a bad day? None of it sounded like an adequate excuse anymore. "What's your name?" the stranger asked, standing up again and fixing Tommy with that steady gaze. Tommy Morrison," he replied, wondering why he was being so cooperative. Something about this man demanded honesty. "Well, Tommy Morrison, my name is Jason, and I think you and I need to have a longer conversation about the kind of man you want to be." Jason looked around at the gathered neighbors, many of whom were nodding in approval at his words. "But first, we need to take care of this dog." Jason pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Hello, Dr. Martinez. This is Jason. I've got an injured dog here on Maple Street that needs to be looked at." "Yes, I'll bring him in right away, thank you." Tommy watched in growing confusion and admiration as Jason carefully untied the dog's leash from the lamppost. The golden retriever seemed to sense that this man meant no harm, allowing itself to be gently lifted despite its obvious discomfort. "Wait," Tommy said suddenly. "That's not even my dog. I mean, I don't know whose it is, but someone just left it there." Jason paused, looking at Tommy with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You're right, but does that change what happened? Does it make what you did any less wrong?" The question hung in the air between them. Tommy realized that Jason wasn't just talking about the dog anymore. He was talking about taking responsibility, about being the kind of person who helped instead of hurt, regardless of whether anyone was watching or whether there would be consequences. "No," Tommy said quietly. "No, it doesn't. I'm going to take this dog to the veterinarian," Jason continued. "The bill will probably be around $200, maybe more if there's internal damage. Are you prepared to pay for that?" Tommy's heart sank. $200 was money he didn't have, not with rent due tomorrow and his bank account already running on empty. But looking at the injured animal in Jason's arms, then at the faces of his neighbors, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "Yes," he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'll pay for it." Jason studied Tommy's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was being sincere. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once. "Good. Get your bike and follow me to the animal hospital. We'll figure out the rest from there." As Tommy kick-started his Harley, his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear anymore, but from something else. A mixture of shame, determination, and strange gratitude toward this stranger who could have just called the police but instead was giving him a chance to make things right. The small procession made its way through the neighborhood streets, Jason walking briskly while carrying the injured dog, Tommy following slowly on his motorcycle, and several neighbors trailing behind at a distance, curious to see how this unusual evening would unfold. Tommy found himself thinking about his father, who had died when Tommy was 16. His dad had always said that a man's character was revealed not by his mistakes, but by what he did after making them. Tonight, for the first time in years, Tommy was going to find out what kind of character he really had. The veterinary clinic was only 6 blocks away, but the journey felt like the longest ride of Tommy's life. With every block, he found himself more curious about the man named Jason, who had appeared like some kind of guardian angel, or avenging angel, depending on how you looked at it, at exactly the right moment. The Martinez Veterinary Clinic was a small, friendly-looking building with large windows and a hand-painted sign featuring various animals. Dr. Elena Martinez met them at the door, her kind eyes immediately focusing on the injured golden retriever in Jason's arms. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades caring for animals. "Bring him straight back to exam room 2, she said without preamble, leading them through a waiting area decorated with photos of happy pets and their families. Tommy followed awkwardly, his motorcycle boots loud on the polished floors, feeling completely out of place in the clean, caring environment. Dr. Martinez gently took the dog from Jason and placed him on the examination table. The golden retriever was still anxious, but he seemed to understand that these people were trying to help. His tail gave a tentative wag when the veterinarian spoke to him in soothing Spanish mixed with English. "What happened to him?" Dr. Martinez asked, her hands expertly feeling along the dog's ribs and checking for other injuries. Jason looked pointedly at Tommy, who felt his face burn with shame again. The fluorescent lights in the exam room made everything seem stark and unforgiving, highlighting every detail of what he'd done. I kicked him," Tommy said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was having a bad day, and I took it out on him. It was wrong. I know it was wrong." Dr. Martinez paused in her examination and looked at Tommy with surprise. Most people didn't voluntarily admit to animal abuse, especially not with such obvious remorse. Her expression softened slightly, though concern remained in her eyes. "At least you're being honest about it," she said, returning her attention to the dog. "That's more than I usually get in situations like this." The examination took about 20 minutes. Dr. Martinez was thorough, checking not just the obvious injury but making sure there was no internal damage or other problems. She took x-rays, listened to the dog's heart and lungs, and tested his reflexes. Throughout it all, Tommy found himself genuinely worried about the animal he had hurt. The good news, Dr. Martinez finally announced, is that there's no serious damage. He has some bruising along his ribs and he's obviously shaken. Up, but nothing is broken. I'll give him some pain medication and anti-inflammatory drugs. He should be fine in a few days. Tommy felt a wave of relief so strong it surprised him. He hadn't realized how much he'd been dreading the possibility of serious injury. However, Dr. Martinez continued, her tone becoming more serious. We have another problem. This dog isn't microchipped and he doesn't have any identification tags. Someone clearly abandoned him on that street corner. Jason had been quiet during the examination, but now he spoke up. So what happens to him now? Well, we'll need to contact animal control. They'll hold him for the required time to see if an owner comes forward. But after that, she shrugged sadly. The shelters are overcrowded. Golden retrievers usually get adopted quickly, but you never know. Tommy looked at the dog, who was now lying more comfortably on the examination table. Despite everything that had happened, the animal looked up at him without fear or anger. Dogs, Tommy realized, were much more forgiving than people. How much do I owe you? Tommy asked, reaching for his wallet with hands that weren't quite steady. For the exam, x-rays, and medications, it comes to $180, Dr. Martinez replied. Tommy opened his wallet and counted out the bills, most of his rent money, but he'd figure that out later somehow. As he handed over the cash, he felt Jason watching him closely. There's something else, Dr. Martinez said as she accepted the payment. This dog is going to need someone to monitor him for the next few days. The medication needs to be given twice daily, and someone should watch for signs of complications. The shelter can't do that? Jason asked. Dr. Martinez shook her head. They're understaffed and overcrowded. They do their best, but individual attention like this, it's difficult. An idea began forming in Tommy's mind, one that surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew him. He'd never had a pet before. His lifestyle had never seemed compatible with taking care of another living creature. But looking at this dog that he'd hurt, this innocent animal that had been abandoned and then abused, Tommy felt something shift inside him. What if... Tommy started, then stopped, unsure of himself. What if what? Jason prompted, and there was something encouraging in his voice. What if I took care of him? Just until he's better, I mean. It's my fault he's hurt, so maybe I should be the one to make sure he heals properly. Dr. Martinez raised her eyebrows. You want to foster him? I guess, yeah, if that's allowed. I mean, I know I'm probably not the ideal candidate given what happened, but Tommy looked at the dog again, who was now sitting up on the examination table, looking more alert. I think I owe him that much. Jason crossed his arms and studied Tommy carefully. Do you have any experience with dogs? No, Tommy admitted. But I can learn, right? People take care of animals all the time. How hard can it be? Dr. Martinez and Jason exchanged a look that Tommy couldn't quite interpret. It's not just about feeding him, Dr. Martinez explained. Dogs need exercise, training, companionship. They need consistency and patience, and this particular dog has been through trauma, first being abandoned, then being hurt. He's going to need extra care and understanding. I understand, Tommy said, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. But I want to try. I need to try. Jason was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but you're not doing this alone. What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to help you. Check in on you. Make sure you're doing right by this dog. Think of it as accountability. Tommy felt a mix of gratitude and nervousness. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Jason's expression grew thoughtful. Let's just say I believe people can change, but only if they're serious about it. Are you serious about this, Tommy? Tommy looked at the golden retriever who had somehow managed to maintain his gentle nature, despite everything that had happened to him. The dog represented something Tommy had never really thought about before, the possibility of being responsible for something other than himself. Of being someone who helped rather than hurt. Yeah, Tommy said finally. Yeah, I'm serious. The next morning, Tommy woke up to the strange sensation of being watched. Opening his eyes, he found himself face to face with the golden retriever, who was sitting patiently beside his bed with what looked almost like a smile. Sunlight was streaming through the small window of Tommy's studio apartment, and for a moment he couldn't remember why there was a dog in his home. Then it all came rushing back, the previous evening's events, his impulsive decision to foster the animal he'd hurt, and Jason's promise to help him through the process. Tommy sat up slowly, still not quite believing this was his new reality. "Hey there, boy," he said softly, reaching out to pet the dog's head. The retriever's tail began wagging enthusiastically, apparently harboring no grudges about their first meeting. "I guess you're my responsibility now." Tommy had spent most of the night reading about dog care on his phone and preparing his small apartment. He'd moved his motorcycle magazines and tools to make space, bought dog food and bowls from a 24-hour convenience store, and set up a makeshift bed using old blankets. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning routine proved more challenging than Tommy had anticipated. The dog needed to go outside immediately, which meant getting dressed quickly and figuring out how to use the leash that Dr. Martinez had provided. Then there was breakfast, measuring the right amount of food, making sure the water bowl was clean and full, and administering the morning dose of medication. By the time Jason knocked on his door at 9 o'clock, Tommy was already feeling overwhelmed but oddly proud of himself. He'd managed to keep the dog comfortable and happy for 12 whole hours. "How did the first night go?" Jason asked, stepping into the small apartment. He looked around, taking in the obvious efforts Tommy had made to accommodate his new responsibility. "Better than I expected, actually," Tommy admitted. "He slept on the floor next to my bed. Didn't make any noise or mess or anything, but I keep worrying I'm doing something wrong." Jason knelt down to greet the dog, who immediately warmed to him as he had the night before. "What have you named him?" Tommy felt embarrassed. "I haven't really thought of a name yet. I mean, he's not really mine, right? Someone might still claim him. After 3 days in the system with no owner coming forward, he could legally be yours if you want him," Jason said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But even if you're just fostering, he needs a name. Dogs respond better when they have something to identify with." Tommy thought for a moment, watching the golden retriever interact with Jason. The dog's coat caught the morning sunlight, giving it an almost bronze appearance. "What about Rusty?" Tommy suggested. "I mean, he's kind of golden colored like rust." Jason smiled, the first genuine smile Tommy had seen from him. "Rusty it is. Good choice." The name seemed to fit immediately. Rusty looked up when they said it, his head tilting slightly as if he was considering whether he liked his new identity. "So what now?" Tommy asked. "I gave him his medicine and fed him, but I don't really know what else I'm supposed to do." "Dogs need exercise and mental stimulation," Jason explained. "They also need structure and training. Have you ever walked a dog before?" Tommy shook his head, feeling ignorant again. "All right. First lesson then. Get his leash." They spent the next hour walking around Tommy's neighborhood, with Jason teaching him the basics of dog handling, how to hold the leash properly, how to encourage good behavior, how to redirect Rusty when he tried to chase squirrels or greet other dogs too enthusiastically. Tommy was surprised by how much there was to learn. "You're doing well," Jason said, as they returned to Tommy's apartment building. "But this is just the beginning. Taking care of a dog is a long-term commitment. It means getting up early every day, coming home at lunch to let him out, spending money on food and veterinary care, giving up some of your freedom." Tommy nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood what Jason was trying to tell him. "I can handle it." "Can you?" Jason stopped walking and looked directly at Tommy. "Yesterday you kicked this dog because you were having a bad day. What happens the next time you have a bad day? What happens when your girlfriend breaks up with you, or you lose your job, or your rent gets raised? Will you take it out on Rusty?" The questions hit Tommy like physical blows. He wanted to protest, to insist that he would never hurt Rusty again, but Jason's point was valid. Tommy's problem wasn't just that he'd hurt a dog, It was that he had a pattern of lashing out when life got difficult. "I don't know," Tommy said honestly. "I want to say I'd never do that again, but you're right. I have a temper. When things go wrong, I get angry, and sometimes I do stupid things." Jason nodded approvingly at the honesty. "Recognition is the first step, but recognition isn't enough. You need to develop better coping mechanisms." "Like what?" "We'll work on that. But for now, I want you to make me a promise. If you ever feel like you might hurt Rusty, if you're angry or frustrated and you feel that urge to lash out, you call me immediately. Day or night, it doesn't matter. You call me before you do anything you'll regret." Tommy pulled out his phone and saved Jason's number. "I promise. But can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why are you helping me? I mean, you could have just called the cops last night and been done with it. Instead, you're spending your morning teaching me how to walk a dog. Most people would think I don't deserve this kind of help." Jason was quiet for a long moment, watching Rusty sniff around a fire hydrant. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Tommy had heard it before. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were yesterday," Jason said. "But more importantly, Rusty deserves to be safe and cared for. If helping you become a better person means Rusty gets the life he deserves, then it's worth my time." Tommy felt something tighten in his chest. Gratitude mixed with determination, mixed with fear of disappointing this man who barely knew him, but was willing to invest in his potential. As they walked back upstairs to Tommy's apartment, Rusty trotting happily between them, Tommy realized that his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. He had a dog depending on him, a mentor holding him accountable, and a growing understanding that being a decent human being required more effort than he'd ever imagined. The transformation had started with a moment of cruelty, but maybe, just maybe, it would end with something much better. 3 weeks had passed since that evening on Maple Street, and Tommy's life had settled into a routine he never could have imagined. Every morning at 6:30, Rusty would wake him with gentle nudges and expectant brown eyes. After their morning walk, Tommy would prepare breakfast for both of them before heading to work at the auto shop. During his lunch break, he'd race home to let Rusty out and spend a few precious minutes playing fetch in the small courtyard behind his apartment building. The most surprising part was how much he enjoyed it all. Tommy had never considered himself a nurturing person, but watching Rusty's injuries heal and his confidence grow gave him a satisfaction he'd never experienced before. The dog had gone from cowering at loud noises to greeting neighbors enthusiastically, and Tommy felt proud knowing he'd played a part in that recovery. Jason had been true to his word about helping. He stopped by every few days, sometimes to check on Rusty's progress, sometimes just to talk. Tommy had learned that Jason worked in film stunts and action choreography, which explained his impressive physical presence and the vaguely familiar feeling Tommy had experienced when they first met. More importantly, Jason had become something Tommy had never really had before, a mentor who genuinely cared about his growth as a person. On this particular Thursday evening, Tommy was in the courtyard throwing a tennis ball for Rusty when Sarah, his ex-girlfriend, appeared at the building's back gate. They'd broken up 2 weeks earlier, an event that Tommy had dreaded might trigger his old angry responses. Instead, he'd found himself focusing on Rusty's needs and working through his emotions with Jason's guidance. "I heard you got a dog," Sarah said, watching as Rusty bounded back with the ball, tail wagging furiously. "News travels fast," Tommy replied, taking the slobbery ball and throwing it again. "How have you been?" Sarah looked different somehow, more relaxed than he remembered seeing her in months. "I've been good, actually. Better than I expected." She paused, then added, "You look different, too." Tommy glanced down at himself. He was wearing the same type of clothes he'd always worn, but he supposed there might be something different in how he carried himself. Taking care of another living creature had given him a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. "Rusty keeps me busy," Tommy said. "Turns out dogs are a lot of work." "That's not what I meant." Sarah stepped closer to the fence, watching as Rusty performed an elaborate series of spins before dropping the ball at Tommy's feet. "You seem calmer, more settled." Before Tommy could respond, Jason's voice called out from across the courtyard. "Tommy!" Perfect timing. "I brought someone I'd like you to meet." Tommy turned to see Jason approaching with a woman in her 40s who had kind eyes and carried herself with quiet confidence. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, but there was something professional about her demeanor. "Sarah, this is Jason," Tommy said as his mentor reached them. "Jason, this is Sarah, my ex-girlfriend." Jason shook Sarah's hand politely, then gestured to the woman beside him. "Tommy, I'd like you to meet Dr. Rebecca Chen. She's a therapist who specializes in anger management and behavioral change." Tommy felt his stomach drop. "A therapist? Why?" Dr. Chen stepped forward with a warm smile. "Jason told me about your situation and how well you've been doing with Rusty. He thought you might benefit from having some additional tools for managing stress and anger." "I don't need therapy," Tommy said automatically. Though even as he said it, he realized how defensive he sounded. Sarah raised an eyebrow at his tone, and Jason's expression remained neutral but watchful. "That's exactly the kind of response that tells me you probably do need it," Jason said gently. "Tommy, you've made incredible progress these past few weeks, but what happens when something really challenging comes along? What happens if you lose your job or get in an accident or face some other major stress?" Rusty, sensing tension in the air, came over and sat beside Tommy, leaning against his leg in a gesture of support that almost brought tears to his eyes. "I have Rusty now," Tommy said. "And you've been helping me. I'm doing better." "You are doing better," Dr. Chen agreed. "But healing isn't just about having good influences around you. It's about developing internal resources to handle whatever life throws at you. Jason can't be available every time you feel angry, and putting that responsibility on a dog isn't fair to either of you." Sarah spoke up unexpectedly. "Tommy, remember when your dad died? You were so angry all the time, and you wouldn't talk to anyone about it. You just bottled it up until you exploded." The memory hit Tommy hard. After his father's death, he'd spent months picking fights, getting into trouble, pushing away everyone who tried to help him. It had taken years for him to find any stability, and he'd never really addressed the underlying issues that drove his anger. "That was different," Tommy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" Jason asked. "Or was kicking Rusty just another version of the same pattern, getting angry when life hurts and taking it out on whatever's convenient?" The words stung because they were true. Tommy looked down at Rusty, who was looking back at him with complete trust and affection. The idea that he might ever hurt this innocent creature again made him feel physically sick. "What would therapy involve?" Tommy asked reluctantly. Dr. Chen's expression brightened. "We'd work on identifying your triggers, the situations and emotions that tend to lead to explosive anger. Then we'd develop healthier coping strategies, things like deep breathing, physical exercise, communication techniques, ways to channel that energy constructively instead of destructively." "I already exercise," Tommy protested weakly. "I work on bikes all day." "That's physical activity," Dr. Chen replied. "But it's not the same as intentional exercise designed to manage stress. And there's more to anger management than just burning off energy." Tommy looked around at the three faces, watching him. Sarah looked hopeful, Jason looked encouraging, and Dr. Chen looked patient. Rusty was still leaning against him, a warm, solid reminder of how much his choices affected others. "How much does it cost?" Tommy asked finally. "I work on a sliding scale based on income," Dr. Chen said. "For someone in your situation, probably $40 per session." $40 was still a lot of money for Tommy, especially with the added expenses of caring for Rusty. But he found himself nodding anyway. "Okay," he said. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this because I think there's something wrong with me. I'm doing it because I want to be the kind of person Rusty deserves to live with." Dr. Chen smiled widely. "That's actually the best possible reason to start therapy. When we want to change for someone we love, the motivation tends to be much stronger." As they made arrangements for Tommy's first appointment, He realized that his simple decision to kick a dog 3 weeks ago had set in motion a complete transformation of his life. He had a dog who loved him unconditionally, a mentor who believed in his potential, an ex-girlfriend who was seeing positive changes in him, and now a therapist who could help him build the internal strength to match his external progress. After Dr. Chen and Jason left, Sarah lingered by the fence watching Tommy play with Rusty in the fading evening light. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "This isn't easy, what you're doing." Tommy paused in his game of tug-of-war with Rusty. "What do you mean? Most people who hurt someone or something just make excuses and move on. You're actually trying to fix yourself." She smiled softly. "That takes courage." Tommy felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with romantic feelings for Sarah. It was the warmth of being seen and acknowledged for his efforts to become better. "I have to," he said simply. "I can't be the kind of person who hurts innocent things. Not anymore." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Maybe we could be friends again someday, when you've worked through all this." "I'd like that," Tommy said honestly. As Sarah walked away, Tommy realized that some relationships could be healed, even if they couldn't be restored to what they once were. That night, as Rusty settled into his bed beside Tommy's own, the young man reflected on how strange his life had become. 6 months ago, he would have laughed at the idea of going to therapy or caring for a pet. Now both seemed like natural parts of his journey toward becoming someone he could actually respect. He fell asleep with one hand hanging down, to rest on Rusty's warm fur, both of them content in their small apartment that had become a real home. 6 months later, Tommy stood in the same spot on Maple Street where everything had changed. Rusty sat patiently beside him, now wearing a proper collar with tags that read Rusty Morrison and included Tommy's contact information. The dog had filled out beautifully, his golden coat gleaming with health, and his confident demeanor showing no trace of the frightened, abandoned animal he'd once been. Today marked a special occasion. Tommy had just returned from the courthouse where he'd officially adopted Rusty. The paperwork was complete, making their bond legal as well as emotional. More importantly, today was also the day he'd been working toward in therapy for months, facing the scene of his worst moment and acknowledging how far he'd traveled since then. "Feels different now, doesn't it, boy?" Tommy said, scratching behind Rusty's ears. The dog looked up at him with what seemed like understanding, tail wagging gently. Dr. Chen had suggested this visit as part of Tommy's ongoing therapy. They'd been meeting weekly for 6 months, working through his anger patterns, his grief over his father's death, and his tendency to lash out when he felt powerless. The work had been harder than anything Tommy had ever done, but it had also been the most valuable. He'd learned that his anger often stemmed from fear of being hurt, fear of losing control, fear of not being good enough. Understanding those roots had helped him develop better responses. When he felt that familiar surge of frustration rising, he now had tools, breathing exercises, physical outlets, and most importantly, the ability to pause and think before reacting. "Tommy!" He turned to see Jason approaching from across the street, carrying a small gift bag. Over the months, their relationship had evolved from mentor and student to genuine friends. Jason had never revealed exactly why he'd been so invested in Tommy's transformation, but Tommy had stopped needing to know. Some kindnesses didn't require explanation. "How did it go at the courthouse?" Jason asked, reaching down to pet Rusty, who greeted him like an old friend. "It's official," Tommy said, pulling out the adoption papers. "Rusty Morrison is legally mine." Jason grinned. "Congratulations. I brought you something to celebrate." He handed over the gift bag. Inside, Tommy found a professional-looking business card that read, "Morrison Pet Services, Dog Walking and Pet Sitting," with Tommy's name and phone number. "What's this?" Tommy asked, confused. "Mrs. Henderson has been asking me for weeks when you might be available to walk her new puppy," Jason explained. "Apparently word has gotten around the neighborhood about how well you've trained Rusty. Several people have asked about your services." Tommy looked around. The street where he'd once been just another angry young man making poor choices. Now neighbors waved when they saw him walking Rusty. Children asked to pet his dog, and apparently people trusted him enough to care for their beloved pets. "I don't know anything about running a business," Tommy said, though he was touched by the gesture. "You know about dogs now, and you know about responsibility," Jason replied. "The business part can be learned. Besides, it might be a way to make some extra money while doing something you genuinely enjoy." The idea was appealing. Tommy had discovered that he loved working with animals, and his job at the auto shop, while steady, didn't challenge him anymore. He'd been thinking about making changes but hadn't been sure what direction to take. "I'll think about it," Tommy said, pocketing the cards. As they stood talking, a familiar figure approached from down the street. It was Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who had treated Rusty on that first night. She was walking a small terrier mix and smiled warmly when she recognized them. "Tommy, how wonderful to see you and Rusty looking so healthy and happy," she said. "I've been meaning to ask, would you be interested in volunteering at the clinic? We could always use help with the animals, and you have such a natural way with dogs, now." Tommy felt that familiar warmth of being valued and trusted. 6 months ago, he'd been a stranger who hurt animals. Now a professional veterinarian was inviting him to help care for them. "I'd love that," he said without hesitation. "When can I start?" As Dr. Martinez gave him details about volunteer orientation, Tommy realized his life had become something he'd never imagined possible. He had meaningful work, genuine friendships, a beloved pet, and most importantly, he'd developed into someone he could respect. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from across the street. A man in his 30s was yelling at a small child who was crying, his words harsh and his body language aggressive. The situation looked like it might escalate into something worse. Tommy felt that old familiar surge of anger, not at the child, but at the adult who was taking out his frustrations on someone smaller and defenseless. For a moment his hands clenched into fists, and he had the urge to march across the street and give the man a piece of his mind. But then he felt Rusty's warm presence beside him, and remembered Dr. Chen's lessons about choosing his responses carefully. Instead of charging in with anger, Tommy took a deep breath and considered his options. "I should go over there," he said to Jason, "but not the way I would have 6 months ago." Jason nodded approvingly. "What's your plan?" "Be helpful, not aggressive. De-escalate instead of escalating." Tommy walked calmly across the street with Rusty at his side. When he got close enough, he called out in a friendly voice, "Hey, is everything okay over here?" The man turned, still angry but surprised by the polite intervention. The child, a little girl about 6 years old, was clutching a broken toy and sobbing. "Just dealing with my daughter's carelessness," the man said tersely. "She broke her new toy not even an hour after getting it." Tommy knelt down to the child's level, Rusty automatically sitting beside him. "That's a pretty toy," he said gently. "What happened to it?" Through her tears, the little girl explained that she'd accidentally dropped it while trying to show it to a friend. It was clearly an accident, the kind of thing that happened to children all the time. "You know," Tommy said to the father, keeping his voice calm and understanding, "I work on fixing things for a living. This looks like something that could be repaired with a little glue and patience. Would you like me to take a look?" The man's anger seemed to deflate slightly. "You'd do that?" "Sure. Accidents happen to everyone. No point in getting upset over something that can be fixed." As Tommy carefully examined the broken toy and explained to both father and daughter how it could be repaired, he caught Jason watching from across the street with an expression of pride and approval. 20 minutes later, the little girl was smiling again. Her father was thanking Tommy profusely, and Rusty had made a new friend who kept giggling at his gentle kisses. Walking back to join Jason, Tommy realized that this moment represented everything he'd worked so hard to become. Instead of responding to conflict with more conflict, he'd chosen to be part of the solution. Instead of anger, he'd offered help. Instead of judgment, he'd shown compassion. That, Jason said as they rejoined him, was perfectly handled. Tommy looked down at Rusty. who gazed back with those trusting brown eyes that had seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. "I learned from the best teacher," Tommy said, patting his dog's head. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from those who forgive us when we don't deserve it." As the sun set over Maple Street, Tommy Morrison walked home with his best friend, no longer the angry young man who had kicked a dog in frustration, but someone who had learned that true strength came from choosing kindness, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. The transformation was complete, not because he'd never feel angry again, but because he now had the tools and wisdom to choose love over violence, help over harm, and growth over stagnation. Rusty had saved him just as much as he'd saved Rusty, and together they'd built a life worth living.